Welcome to the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Baha'i history, Baha'i sacred texts, Baha'i philosophical and theological concepts, and world religions from a Baha'i and comparative perspective. I am Robert Stockman, director of the center, and joining me today is Lex Musta, who is a co-founder of the African American Historical Alliance of South Carolina, a project director working on restorative justice initiatives with the History, Arts, and Science Action Network, and an independent researcher whose work focuses on the role of social meanings in shaping race relations. Lex's research and efforts have been pivotal in the discovery and restoration of tombstones from the Columbian Harmony Cemetery, a historic African-American burial ground that was relocated in 1960 to make room for commercial development. Lex is a frequent lecturer and author on the history and contemporary challenges of the struggle for race amity in the United States, with a particular call to allies to honor others and work for mutual advancement. Lex co-authored This Noble Destiny, Abdu'l-Baha, the Early Baha'is of Washington, D.C., and the Struggle for Racial Unity. He holds an MBA from Schiller International University and is currently restoring the mausoleum of Coralie Franklin Cook, whom we will hear about today, while also writing her biography. And by the way, he'll also mention at the end today of ways people can assist with the completion of the work on her mausoleum. So that's pretty much my invitation today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lex, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your presentation about Coralie Franklin Cook and Corinne True.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that very kind introduction. And I'm very glad to be you all here. I'm broadcasting from the traditional lands of the Monacan Indigenous Nation, which is between the fall line and the Shenandoah Mountains behind me. It's so great to be with you all, and of course to share the stage with Robert, who basically wrote the book on Corinne True history, and also to share the stage. I know she's in the audience, Gwendolyn Eder-Lewis, who's on the board of the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History and wrote the book on Coralie Franklin Cook's history. So it's wonderful to be here and with all of you in the audience. Today, I know in the center, you've before hosted talks about Corinne True. What I hope to show is this wonderful story of these two amazing Baha'i women who've led parallel lives since 1861, when they were both born, through to their embrace of the Baha'i Faith and the Baha'i Faith shaping their lives. It's a wonderful chance to kind of study their history and through the lens of their lives to appreciate the transformative effect of the faith. And I hope to inspire all of you with hope for all Americans to be transformed towards having a greater sense of oneness and brotherhood and love for all people in this nation. So we're going to start going back as far as history allows us to their fourth great-grandparents. So on the left, you have Abraham Trigg, who's already a first-generation American. His father, Daniel, had already arrived in Jamestown, and he was born here in Church City, Virginia. This building you see there in Church City, Virginia, is the stone structure that replaced the wooden structure where Abraham Trigg was baptized in 1684. And of course, in contrast to Abraham, Parenthia, Coralie Cook's fourth great-grandmother, was born in 1711. And the image here is the last image of Africa before she experienced the Mafa, which is the Swahili word for horrible injustice, of being brought over to America. And she arrived after being impregnated during the trip by some of the crew. And Thus began two very different lives, two very different family legacies. Abraham Trigg's family, after starting there, they had a model of economics which just required land, because you had all these prisoners to work the land, so they would just need more land to work their prisoners upon. And so Daniel Trigg, born in 1711, moved over to Spotsylvania, Virginia, north of me here. And here's a picture of 1700s Spotsylvania, Virginia. And he is continuing this land. And there's an image of his brother included here. His name is William Trigg, Daniel's brother William, just to give you an idea of what they looked like and how they dressed. But in contrast, you see the image that Parenthia first saw when she arrived. This is Appomattox Manor, the Epps family prison. And they were very large establishment that they had there. Overlooks on this cliff, beautiful view of the Potomac River, of the James River. And in this house is where Parenthia arrived, pregnant with Elizabeth, who was then born in 1735. And it is at this location where a wedding happened with Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law, John Wales, marrying into the Epps family. And as a wedding gift, Parenthia had to depart from her daughter. Her 11-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Hemmings, was given as a wedding gift as an 11-year-old. And so that departure from this location called Appomattox Manor into the Forest Manor of John Wales was Coralie's first experience, carrying no generational wealth from one location to the next, whereas the Trigg family was growing generational wealth over this time. So you start to see the difference between Coralie's family's experience and Corinne's family's experience. And as we move to their second great-grandfathers, Corinne's second great-grandfather, William, continued this economic model of more land, worked with prisoners to accumulate great wealth. And so in the move from Spotsylvania, William moved on this boat, which looks like a houseboat. It has no motor on it. It's called a flatboat. And so this boat would have their prisoners on board, their family, goods. When they arrive through Cincinnati, they pick up some livestock, and then they go down the Ohio River to a place called Harmony Landing. And William Trigg had developed 600 pounds of generational British wealth. So he paid 900 British pounds. He paid for 600 acres. 600 acres, just to give you a sense of how much land the Trigg family had developed in these 3 generations in America. If you stand somewhere and look as far to your left and as far as your right, you can see he owns 3.5 miles in both directions. So further than the eye can see in both directions, and 1/2 mile in inland along this beautiful place that William found called Harmony Landing, because over thousands of years, the river had deposited river silt, making the land very fertile. And then there's a 500-foot cliff upon which their homestead was built. So that way they wouldn't get flooded, and they had good protection there. And so they were invading the Shawnee territory and taking this land and using their proven economic model of farming with prisoners to develop tremendous wealth. And so that was William Trigg's experience. Betty Brown's experience, which is Coralie's second great-grandmother, is in great contrast. She was given away as a wedding present to our future president, Thomas Jefferson, at the age of 12. And President Jefferson's wife, her own mother, died very young. And so you could imagine she might have been very shocked to see Betty brought as a wedding gift, because her mother, Elizabeth Hemmings, had basically played a mother role in Martha Jefferson's life, basically replacing the role of her own mother. And then to see her de facto mother, child ripped from her hands, you wonder what would have Thomas Jefferson said to his new bride to help, explain that this is okay. And luckily, we have a great book by Dr. Joy DeGruy that I recommend you all get called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And in it, Thomas Jefferson published what he might have said to Martha. You could imagine in private what he said, but because this is what he was willing to publish for posterity. Thomas Jefferson explained that there's no problem for Elizabeth about Betty Brown being taken, because he wrote, and I quote, "They smelled bad and were physically unattractive, required less sleep, were dumb, cowardly, and most importantly, incapable of feeling grief." So he explained to his new bride that, don't worry, Elizabeth Hemings is incapable of feeling grief at the loss of her 12-year-old daughter. And so this picture here is on Monticello, where Betty Brown was brought, and they've preserved Elizabeth Hemings' cabin, because after John Wales passed away, Elizabeth Hemings came and joined her daughter on Monticello, and Monticello has preserved her cabin. So when you visit Monticello, you can actually visit Coralie's third great grandmother's cabin. And so Betty Brown raised her family in Monticello, again, not developing wealth, while William Trigg had these 7 miles of land in Kentucky. So here on the left, you have a picture of Corinne's great-grandmother, Martha, where she was born. There's a picture of her gravestone there. And you can see there's that little ridge that's kind of 500 feet up where this cliff is, overlooking these fertile lowlands where the family got established at Harmony Landing. And so they continue to shrink and split that 600 acres because every generation, gets a slice. So Martha's land is 132 acres. So it's, smaller and smaller portions, but still having a lot of prison labor there. And in contrast, you have Brown Colbert. This is Coralie's great-grandfather. Thanks to Monticello's more kind of developed thinking, they now have a monument to Coralie's great-grandfather. This word, Brown Colbert, is on a monument on top of Monticello. And just down the hill, in front of this monument, you come down to the cemetery of Elizabeth Hemings, who is buried there. And they've preserved it very nicely with a special place for descendants of those who had been freedom seekers on Monticello, where they can go and remember their dead. And so Elizabeth Hemings is down there, and Brown Colbert is modified. Now, Brown Colbert was very clever and a very significant moment in Coralie's life, because in 1805, Thomas Jefferson was building the left wing of Monticello, if you've ever been there, those stone buildings. And he hired John Jordan, who's a Presbyterian. And Presbyterians believed in teaching those of African descent because they should be able to read the Bible and save their soul. And they should also get married so they don't live in sin, unlike Thomas Jefferson, who did neither of those things. And so Brown Colbert fell in love with Mary, who John Jordan had brought from Lexington with him to take care of him while he works on this structure. And they fell in love. And then together, Brown Colbert, together with Betty Brown, they appealed to Thomas Jefferson and convinced him to permit Brown to live with his wife and leave Monticello. So this was very important because in 1827, when Thomas Jefferson died, all of his enslaved people were sent to the 10 corners of the earth. But Brown Colbert had kept his family together, and they had moved as a unit to Lexington, Virginia, where he raised his family and where Coralie would be born. So this sense of agency in the middle of the most difficult conditions was an important moment in Coralie's life. Then Corinne's grandfather stayed working that land in the same way. And then on the other hand, Melinda, who is Coralie's grandmother, she was again moved. Brown Colbert saw the importance of never getting your family split up during an estate sale. And so he moved his daughter, Melinda, over to the McDowell family. And the McDowell family, their prison is called Col Alto. And so this is where Coralie's grandmother was raised. And here's a picture of one of Melinda's nieces, who was also called Melinda. So it kind of gives you a first image we see of Coralie's family. This woman was born in 1849. And so we kind of get a sense of the place they're born in Lexington, Virginia, this Presbyterian place where they're allowed to be taught to read. Coralie's older sister, Coraline, and her older brother, Robert, were both at a school run by Stonewall Jackson in Lexington by the Presbyterians to teach people to read. So this was where her family was now developing. So we finally get to the parents. And it's interesting that the Presbyterian faith played a big role in Corinne's life. You see pictured there her father, Reverend Knight. Through the same reasons that John Jordan respected Coralie's family and allowed a married couple to stay together, Reverend Knight, one of his first positions was to attempt to form a church for those of African descent in Louisville. And so that was really interesting that he, had developed that sense of honor and dignity. And therefore, when he got married to Martha Knight, he was quick to convince her to liberate all those that they enslaved. So you see that this Presbyterian influence in both Coralie's life and in Corinne's life. And similarly, on the right-hand side, you have the grave of Coralie's mother. And we don't have a picture of her mother, but this is a picture of her mother's brother, George, who we do have lucky enough to have a picture of, again, to give you some sense of what Coralie's family might have looked like at this time. To the present day, one funny, interesting thing is Corinne was the oldest of her brothers and sisters, and she had a brother named Robert and a sister named Mary, and Coralie is the youngest of her brothers and sisters, but she also had a brother named Robert and a sister named Mary. The picture on the right is Ariel Franklin, who carries on the Franklin name of Coralie's mother. She is one of Robert's descendants, her older brother Robert's descendants. And on the left side is one of the descendants of Corinne's brothers and sisters. So finally, we come to their birth. So now you have a picture of Corinne as a child living on the Knight plantation in Harmony Landing, Kentucky. And then you see the building, not in which Coralie lived, but she certainly would have been in there in the kitchen serving with her mother and her grandmother. And we have a nice picture of the family that Coralie was first exposed to. Here is Sally McDowell, and then her future husband, John Miller. So this whole book's written about those people who enslaved Coralie in this fantastic building that still stands. It's now a hotel in Lexington, Virginia, you can stay at. So one was born as a freedom seeker, and one was born with slaves inside, enslaved people inside their house. So you have this contrast to their births. And then they also had a contrast with their experience with the Civil War. Corinne's mother ran a uniform factory inside their house and frequently hid people who were raiding the Union Army in her home. So consequently, this is a picture of Colonel Buckley, who raided her house. And one of Corinne's first memories of her life is the scary image of Union soldiers shutting down the uniform factory and looking for those escaped of those bandits hiding in the home. So she describes that as a terrifying reaction to the Union Army, whereas Coralie was liberated by this gentleman, General David Hunter. He's known as Lincoln's abolitionist general because he was an abolitionist. And he went to Coralie's town of Lexington. Here's a famously bombed out room. And he liberated this town. And Coralie joined 200 wagons together with a group of Ohio abolitionist-led soldiers to protect them. And they went into West Virginia along this line. So you can picture 200 wagons and all these people leaving everything they knew, heading towards freedom as a little 3-year-old girl. So a very different experience with the war, one of liberation and one of this kind of terror. And luckily, Coralie is a writer. And in a 1929 short story, she described the moment of freedom. And I have to think it's informed from her own experience. She said, "A great joy was upspringing, replacing the dirge of a slave for life. A new song was singing itself through all his being, the song of freedom." So this gives us a sense from a first-person account, from someone who experienced this transition in their own lifetime. You see Coralie shared this in her 1929 short story. So, as I mentioned, Reverend Knight is very forward-thinking. He started perhaps the first integrated school in Kentucky, and Corinne's first school experience was within this integrated school, a one-room schoolhouse, which was to serve both those who had been liberated and who lived in the area, those who the Knights had freed before, and also those of European descent in the area who had no other school to go to, including Corinne. Meanwhile, Coralie was also being educated. Even before the end of the Civil War, these wonderful Free Will Baptists from Massachusetts had come down to Winchester, where her parents were working at the largest hospital in America, and they began giving education to the children. So 3-year-old Coralie made such an impression on the teachers that they said to the parents, you know, your child, her future is in freedom. And for them to make that statement and for Coralie to remember it must have shown you how different was this experience, how shocking was this racial experience of positivity. Because in this book, which is hundreds of letters of Sally McDowell, her enslaver, one of the letters writes about Coralie's older brother and sister, Robert and Caroline, and she calls them mosquitoes because she hadn't had her own first daughter, Susanna, yet. So all she could think of these children running around, not contributing economically to her at all, she called them mosquitoes. They were such a bother to her. So coming from mosquitoes to somebody saying, your future is in freedom, shows you the dramatic influence that these Reverend Beckett had teaching Coralie in Winchester in 1864. So outgrowing that school, Corinne's mother and father thought they should send her to Louisville Female Seminary in 1875. And here's a picture of it. You can see what a beautiful schoolhouse Corinne was now going to in Louisville. And about the same time, Reverend Beckett, who they met in Winchester, had reached back out to Coralie's family and invited them to come study at the new school he set up, Storer College. And as you can see, the original schoolhouse still stands, and it's equally beautiful to Corinne's. And Coralie was getting a first-grade education from the Free Will Baptists at Storer College at the same time as Corinne was going to Louisville Female Seminary. Thanks to Coralie's family, we now have the earliest picture we have ever had of Coralie. As you study this picture, you might be able to recognize which one she is. She is number 4. That's Coralie Franklin right there, going to Storer College. Behind her is Reverend Beckett and Mrs. Beckett, the teachers and who ran Storer College. And so we have this wonderful image looking at us, you know, from 160 years ago, you know, Coralie with her full of her ambition and full of her intelligence and her full of her brilliance, you know, looking at you in this picture. So I'm very grateful to Coralie's family for providing us with this image to help share us more insight into her. Alas, Corinne's family was brought out of Kentucky by a tragedy, the fire of Chicago. And to look after their real estate businesses in Chicago, they moved the family to Chicago. So from Kentucky to this big city, which of course, Corinne would go on to transform that city with the Baha'i temple. And as I just told you, Coralie's family had similarly made a move from Winchester, where they first experienced freedom, to Harper's Ferry, where Coralie and her one of her sisters, Mary Elizabeth, would be studying at Storer College. So you have these two big moves that would define these two families. I haven't studied to confirm which school Corinne went to in Chicago, but it was likely Dearborn Seminary, as there were not that many schools in Chicago at the time that would cater to those of the wealth of the True family. But it was likely Dearborn Seminary. And at the same time, over in Coralie's life, as an 18-year-old, she was already working. So on top of her studies at Storer, she was already teaching in Knoxville, Maryland, at a one-room schoolhouse like the one that Corinne went to. And so Coralie, you can see from the lack of those 4 generations of wealth build up. You know, the 900 pounds they had earned through their hard labor was not given to them. So she is already working as an 18-year-old, while Corinne as an 18-year-old is just focused on studies. But Corinne's mother was quite upset at the Northern school and the influence of these other Northerners. So she relocated her to Augusta Female Seminary in Stanton, Virginia, which is actually quite close to Lexington, where Coralie was born. And consequently, you have Coralie going to Storer on one side of the West Virginia border in a segregated African descent school. And then on the other side of the West Virginia border, you have Corinne going to school quite close to each other at a segregated European descent school amongst Southerners to teach Southern living. Now, Coralie graduated 2 years earlier, but she continued postgraduate studies that Corinne never did. In 1881, she graduated from the National School of Elocution and Oratory in Philadelphia, and then she continued even further getting educated in 1882 at Emerson College of Oratory in Boston. So Coralie is highly educated. So at that point, Corinne's life seemed quite set for a typical woman of her class and status in America. She got married the moment she graduated, and she had her first child, Harriet, in 1883. Now, Coralie wasn't lucky enough to be in such a position of ease. She had to become a school teacher at Storer in 1882, the first woman of African descent to be a school teacher there. In 1884, she purchased her first home. Unlike Corinne, with generational wealth, she had to earn it. And she purchased this home, which is a beautiful home. This picture doesn't do it justice. It's located right beside Storer College President's home, and then 2 doors down from the heart of the Storer College campus. So she would have had a really beautiful walk every day from her home to teach her classes in campus and come back home right beside it. So Coralie had this wonderful life that she had started for herself. And that same year, she became the first female of European or African descent of Storer College. So clearly Coralie's on this meteoric career path, and Corinne's on this path towards motherhood and homemaking. By 1888, Corinne had had 4 children, Harriet, Lawrence, Davis, and Edna. And by this point, Coralie is now outgrowing Harper's Ferry and is getting a national voice. Her brother-in-law runs one of the largest newspapers in the country, Pioneer Press, and Coralie's in charge of the women's column, which was giving her exposure through sharing that page with other writers that she would invite to write with all the women in the nation. And at the same time, she was founding the Mountain Hope branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So she was already getting invited into civil rights. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this is Frances Harper, who's a contemporary and peer of Frederick Douglass, was leading the Christian Temperance Union's movement to introduce that brand of civil rights and civil activism to the African descent community. And Coralie was the first to respond from all the southern states. So Coralie was the first responder to Frances Harper's work to spread the influence of the Christian Temperance Union to those of African descent. So Coralie is now part of a national interracial organization, and she's leading it as the founder and president. Now, one interesting aspect of both Coralie and Corinne's life is they were both heavily influenced by women-led religion. And what do I mean by that? I mean, on the right-hand side, you have Mrs. Beckett. She is part of the Free Will Baptists. They are the first denomination in all of America to ordain female priests. In 1815, Clarissa Danforth was made a minister of the Free Will Baptists. And that leadership position of women was maintained. They were the first organization in the country to establish a national women's organization in the 1840s. So Coralie kept an association with the Free Will Baptists right from 1864 through 1930. So she had, constant opportunities for leadership and to see leadership of women. So that was a constant influence in Coralie's life. Now, we talked about Harriet, her first child. Unfortunately, she passed away in 1892. She fell down some stairs. This so shook Corinne's world that her and her husband left the Presbyterian faith, and they first joined the Church of Christian Science, which was founded by a woman there. You see Mary Baker Eddy. She founded that in 1879. Then she joined the Unity School of Christianity, which was ferried in the bottom left corner by Myrtle Fillmore. That was established 1889, just 3 years before Harriet's passing. And then finally, she settled upon Divine Science, which also was founded by a woman, Melinda Kramer, in 1888. So she also had an exposure and an expectation that religion can be and should be, led by men and women. And so this was clearly part of both of these women's worldview. So in 1893, Corinne is giving birth to her fifth child, Catherine. And Coralie, at the same time, went down to Missouri, leaving behind Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, to teach at the Hannibal, Missouri Douglas School, which you see pictured in the top right corner, a really impressive building in Missouri. But, in Coralie's heart, she had witnessed so much tragedy. So many of her aunts and uncles had become destitute after enslavement and been given none of their generational wealth that they had earned. And so she became superintendent of the home, the leading home probably in the country for destitute women and children from enslavement, orphans. And so the picture in the bottom right corner is the school or the home that she became the superintendent of. So she is now living in Washington, D.C., where she had some family already there that might have been involved in why she chose to go there. But she's working in this life that she had a calling for. And Corinne is continuing on as a mother. The other twin was named Kenneth, who you see there. So she now has 6 children by 1893. And Coralie, now in this national center of Washington, D.C., outgrows the Temperance Union and joins the Christian Women's League. Their civil rights activism is a little broader. And as the trustee of Storer College, when Storer College blocked those of African descent from using the housing in the summers and only allow the school barracks to be used by those of European descent, you can see a picture here of all the women from DC that she led up to Storer College. And they're standing in front of John Brown's fort, where he led the famous fight against enslavement. She led this group of women there in 1896. I don't know if you can pick out which one is Coralie in that picture. I haven't quite decided which one I think it is, if she is indeed in the picture. But this is the group of women that she led the protest to, of this Colored Women's League, to Harper's Ferry to protest the exclusion of those of African descent. So you can see in 1893 and these two women are not yet on the same parallel path. In 1896, Corinne has her 8th child, Nathaniel, and Coralie has now reached the pinnacle of African descent leadership in the country. This picture in the top right corner is the Women's Building at Atlanta's World Exposition of 1895. They only allowed one person of African descent to enter that building, and that was Coralie Cook. And she spoke just before you see this picture of Clara Barton, who's very famous, for nursing in the country. But Coralie spoke there, and the speech she gave was the history of those of African descent in the country. And so she had this premier position that if you're only going to choose one woman of African descent to speak and only one person of African descent to speak in the Women's Building, they chose Coralie Cook, or Coralie Franklin at that time. So she's already risen to that position of national prominence, widely recognized by those of European descent and African descent as the premier speaker through her power of oratory and, of course, her education. That same year, she'd now been spending 10 years getting mentored by this peer of Frederick Douglass, Frances Harper. And so she works with Frances Harper to form a national association of colored women's clubs, just like she'd been working with for 50 years with the Free Will Baptists, having a national women's organization. She takes the DC Women's Club and all the other women's clubs in the country and founds the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in DC. And Frances Harper was elected as the vice president, and Coralie Cook wrote the constitution of that body. And you see here a picture of the leaders. You see some of the very famous people there that you recognize probably in that picture. Now, in 1899, Corinne True has that moment. Her son Nathaniel and another son both caught diphtheria. They were treated with a batch of medicine, which unfortunately in the future came to be known that the horse they took it from was infected with tetanus. And so even though they were curing the diphtheria, they gave Nathaniel tetanus, which he died from. And so this great tragedy shook her faith. And that's when, in the Baha'i understanding of the afterlife, of everlasting life, whereas divine science said, if you pray enough, your child will survive. Well, she prayed and prayed and prayed, and the child did not survive. So that shook her faith in divine science. And she moved over to the Baha'i faith and their image of eternal life, where your children, Nathaniel, Edna, will continue to progress in the worlds of God, and you will continue to have association with all the souls of the world. And that brought great comfort to Corinne, and she then became a Baha'i in 1899. At the same time, Coralie was getting married and took the kind of progressive stance of keeping her maiden name. So she became Coralie Franklin Cook, which was not common at the time. And she left taking care of the orphans and the widows of the enslaved and began working at Howard University as a professor in the chair of oratory, and also helping to run the board of lady managers at the university. There's a picture of her husband, George Cook. Here's an image of what the school was like in 1899. You can see it's not like today. So this gives you some image of what kind of school Coralie was running and what kind of women she was the lady manager of. And then as soon as Corinne entered the Baha'i faith, right away, she felt that the women should be included on the Chicago Board of Council, because she had just come from this religious context that women can be in the leadership positions. And even though she had just become a Baha'i, she immediately began to advocate for women equality in the Baha'i faith. And that same year, Coralie again is representing all African descent women at a national stage. She went to the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and represent them all at the New York's Home Mission Society. So she's representing a whole group of women. Similarly, in 1899, she presented at the National Free Baptist Women's Missionary Society, at the National Council of Women in the United States. So she represented a body of European and African descent women at a largely European association. So she's taking this great leadership role on the national stage. So in 1900, Corinne received her first of 50 tablets she got from Abdu'l-Baha. And she began pioneering the faith to a new state, Michigan. The first Baha'i teacher in Michigan was Corinne True. And she was doing everything she could within the Baha'i community to push this aspect of female equality. So even though she was not allowed into the Board of Council, every Board of Council decision had to be ratified by the community. So on Sunday, you could be sure Corinne True is going to be speaking up at the ratification portion of their Sunday gatherings to speak and debate and be informed and have her voice heard and influencing decisions of the community. So you can see Corinne True is definitely having this huge impact on the community to raise up the issue of women equality. At the same time, Coralie continues to be the center of the national stage. At the 80th birthday party of the famous Susan B. Anthony, she represented, as you can see on the program, all colored women, Coralie Franklin Cook. And 2 years after that, Susan B. Anthony returned the favor and had a brilliant reception in the honor of Coralie Cook in Rochester, New York. So Coralie Cook is clearly a national figure renowned by all Americans. One famous quote she has from that speech in 1900, "No class of women can be degraded and all womankind not suffer." So you can see how she's trying to influence this gathering of women to not forget about those of African descent. Now, sadly, 1901, Kenneth passes away from diphtheria and tetanus. He's still getting that, the bad medicine. They hadn't discovered it yet. And sadly, he also passes away. Something that I think 1 year after that, no more children almost were passing away from diphtheria. Very sad that Corinne had to undergo that. And that the same year, Coralie finally has the joy of childbirth and gives birth to George Cook. I don't have a picture of George yet, so I just have a picture here of the happy couple. In 1902, the Baha'i community takes a fairly traditional approach to women's issues and created a separate women's assembly of teaching. Most Christian denominations had a separate council for women to work on to assist the church. So did the Baha'is. However, she continued to push the envelope. She led women and men to work together to rent a hall for teaching in Chicago that she felt they needed. There's a picture there of the Women's Assembly of Teaching. At the same time, Coralie is working now outside of Howard, as well as within Howard, at the Washington Conservatory of Music. This was the largest entrepreneurial activity in Washington, D.C., run by Harriet Gibbs Marshall, who's pictured in that corner. And I have a picture of her father, who's a contemporary and friend of Frederick Douglass, Mifflin Wister Gibbs. He was a judge in Kentucky, and he paid for that building in 1902, where they housed that. And interestingly enough, that would be the first place where we held a unity feast in an African descent-owned building in the country in December 1910. So a very important feast took place there, which Coralie went to. And Coralie worked for Harriet Gibbs Marshall, as well as Louis Gregory also worked as treasurer of this institution. So in 1906, again, tragedy strikes Corinne as her son Lawrence passes away just before he's about to be married. But she's now so firm in her faith and so sure of the afterlife that she continues to press on. And she is assigned the task during her first of 9 pilgrimages to the Holy Land, where Abdul Baha, the son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, Baha'u'llah, tasked her with this temple work. And here's a picture of her in 1907, the same year she was tasked with it. She had found the location where today the Wilmette Baha'i Temple is located in north of Chicago. And so here's a picture of them already choosing out the spot and Corinne playing her leading role in establishing that. Meanwhile, Coralie is in Washington, D.C. still, continuing to work. One of Louis Gregory's friends, Harrison Hart, gave them this big farmland south of D.C. where they established the industrial school for colored children, and her husband became the superintendent. And so they're continuing to press on in education work. Now, in 1908, they begin the purchase of that land that they found in 1907, and they receive a tablet that women should be elected to the national body governing the Baha'is. And so Corinne is now working on the temple and has finally received the tablet supporting women's full equality in the Baha'i administration of the faith. At the same time in DC, the Hannans, a great book about the Hannans has been written by one of their descendants called Aflame with Devotion. They had made the big leap in 1902 to begin teaching those of African descent the faith. And it quickly jumped out of their home into the home of Carrie York, whose house is on the left-hand side on Franklin Street. And they're now using, they termed Carrie the candlestick because she was the first African descent individual in America to open her home to the teaching of the Baha'i faith. And so Carrie is learning this faith in 1906. And then Pocahontas Pope, over on the right-hand side, who comes from the wealthiest African descent family in North Carolina, who was fleeing the racial violence of North Carolina and settled in DC. And here on First Street, about 4 streets over from Carrie's house, is Pocahontas Pope's house. And Abdul Baha called her the first of thy race to embrace the faith. And so these teaching efforts now uniquely in Washington, D.C., where Coralie Cook were blossoming. And so therefore, we're so fortunate that the faith that reached a few other cities in 1899, when Corinne True was studying the faith in Chicago, was now in Washington, D.C., where Coralie was. So on the left-hand side, you see Corinne finally elected as the first ever woman elected to a national U.S. Baha'i institution, the Baha'i Temple Unity Convention. That's a picture at their home. You can see there's no people of African descent in the picture. That had not yet happened in Chicago, but she has now achieved that women equality, which will be so important to making the faith embrace its full potential for the equality of men and women. And similarly, on the right-hand side, you see the success of the teaching efforts of the Hannon family. On the right-hand side of this picture, you see Alma Knobloch, one of the sisters of the Pauline Hannon. In the middle, you see Louis Gregory with a hat, looking smart. He's surrounded by Cora York's family in this picture. So you get some image of Millie York, Nellie Gray in that picture. And on the bottom of the picture, in 1929, when Louis Gregory was writing about the history of the DC Baha'i community, he said Edward John Braithwaite, the one on the left there, is the most accomplished American of African descent who's joined the faith yet. So you have him there as a Baha'i, you have Harry Gibbs Marshall as a Baha'i, and then you have Alan Anderson pictured there. He is one of the people who received the tablet with the famous analogy the Baha'i Faith makes of those of African descent as pupil of the eye with the vision. Though dark in color, they have the vision to see the spiritual world in a great clarity. And Alan Anderson, who received that tablet, is in this community that welcomed Coralie in 1910. Right? So you have this wonderful teaching preparation to receive Coralie into that community in 1910 at the same moment as Corinne has finally achieved full equality at the national level. So if we go ahead to 1912, Corinne now has the land, the temple land purchased, and has the son of the Prophet founder Abdul Baha there to dedicate the land. And just at that moment, she's struck with tragedy again. Her son Charles passes away, pictured there. Very tragic. So just before this picture was taken, Abdul Baha took Corinne aside and they had a private talk, to continue to provide her the strength she needs to survive all of this tragedy that she's had with her children in her life. And yet she still developed the strength and faith to help this dedication ceremony. And here on the right-hand side, in that same year, Coralie and George helped prepare Howard University, the only university in the southern United States that hosted Abdul Baha, which was Howard University, to give his talk on April 23rd. And Coralie went again to hear him, was so impressed that she went again in Green Acre in August to hear him a second time. And here's a picture of myself at the place where Abdul Baha talked, the Rankin Chapel. I was doing my best Joseph Hannon impersonation there. Now, in 1912 marks another significant moment in Corinne's life. She finally integrated the Chicago House of Spirituality. So even though she was already elected to the Baha'i Temple Unity, she finally broke the segregation on the House of Spirituality in Chicago, which kind of administered the Chicago affairs. And so that was a significant moment in Corinne's life, something that she'd been working to ever since 1899 when she first joined the faith. And that same year, Coralie declares. And one nice statement we get from Gwendolyn Etter Lewis's book about her mindset. Remember, in 1910, she attended that event where all of the Baha'is were together in Harry Gibbs Marshall's house. And she said, we're very generally impressed not only with the wisdom of your teaching. This was written in 1910, so she's still talking about the Hannon family's teaching, but with the earnestness and sincerity of the teachers. So clearly the community was not just integrated in name, but in heart. And that attracted Coralie. She left us a wonderful writing of her mindset at the time she declared. Weary and heart sore, discouraged with the churches that close their doors to them, the silent pulpits that should thunder forth in trumpet tones against the inequities in the pews. It were strange indeed if the Baha'i teachings waken no response of great hope in the hearts of colored people. So she's had a response of great hope to this Baha'i teaching. And then to show that the two of their worlds have not yet connected in a Baha'i sense, in 1915 brought them both to San Francisco. Corinne attended, as you would expect, the first ever Baha'i World Congress. So 1915, here's a part of the program you can see there on the left side, the Panama Pacific International Exposition. So Corinne True is attending this world exposition. But the Baha'is did not invite Coralie to speak because they had not yet, the whole community didn't know her yet. And so she instead attended this program. This is a 115-year-old program in my hands, a 110-year-old program from that 1915 exposition. She was speaking against human trafficking. It was a anti-human trafficking conference at the same Panama Pacific International Exposition, but held at a different day. And so this event, they did recognize her importance, and they invited her again as the woman of to represent all women of African descent. She was represented by this group at the Purity Congress as she was responded there. And she really enjoyed that trip. She was able to travel with her husband across the whole country to San Francisco and saw Yosemite and Denver and many, many beautiful sights along the way. That same year, or just before, she was also declared Man of the Month in the NAACP magazine called The Crisis. So you see, she continues to be on a national stage of national renown. She was also announced to join the Board of Education in DC. And here is her brother-in-law describing Coralie Cook in 1914. She is a womanly woman, far-seeing, a deep and careful thinker, a solver of knotty problems, rich in experience, happy in debate for right and race uplift. And as for the gray of the brain, no woman in Washington has more. Notice she didn't say no woman of African descent. No woman in Washington has more of the gray of the brain than Coralie Cook. So 1915 also saw Corinne visit and have an audience with the Queen of Hawaii, Lydia Lililuloloko. And so she's traveling in this circle with queens. And Coralie, again, was representing at the Symposium of Leading Thinkers for Colored America. She was speaking there about votes for women. So she continues to take a national stage. And in 1915, she's also very artistic. She helped produce the Star of Ethiopia, which was a big artistic presentation in 1915 DC. So finally, 1915 also brought the completion of the first $200,000 of funding. And Corinne was in charge of the funding. She was writing letters to everyone who donated, thank you letters, encouraging. And she had finally brought together $200,000. Now, ironically, Coralie was also invited to Chicago that year by the governor of the state, no less. And she became the only Baha'i representative at the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of emancipation in America. And it's not like those of European descent didn't know about it. Susan Lawrence Dana was appointed by the governor as the only woman on the organizing committee. It was often known as the Lincoln Jubilee because Lincoln was so closely associated with that liberation. And so this wonderful event brought Coralie finally to Chicago, but I don't think the two of them have met yet. Now, 1919 brings Corinne to having one of her 9 pilgrimages to the Holy Land, where she's getting this advice and she's getting this guidance from Abdul Baha that she brings and blesses America with. And Coralie is also continues to advance things. Here she's advancing an artistic association, which is basically laying the groundwork for the Harlem Renaissance. About 8 years later, Dr. Alain Locke, called it the New Negro Movement, saying that we're capable of expression in all the arts. We're not just laborers and doing field work. And you can see that Coralie was elected as the president of the DC Arts Association, with many of the most famous people from the Harlem Renaissance. Jessie Fawcett, you can see here as corresponding secretary of this organization. So she's really leading an artistic movement that is to become so important for America. So 1922 and 1921 kind of marks a landmark year for these two works. On the one hand, Corinne as finally the first ever gathering in the foundation hall beneath the future temple. You can see her here pictured in the bottom right of this picture. She's there. She's, 1907, she was given this task, and 1922, 15 years later, she's accomplished it. She's built the structures there, the land is purchased, the building's literally going up. Similarly, at the same time, Coralie is building the infrastructure of race amity in America. So you can think of Corinne as building infrastructure of this temple. Coralie is building the infrastructure of race amity. And here, amid the racial violence that was plaguing the whole nation, 1919 through 1921, the Baha'is held a race amity conference at the direction of Abdul Baha. And at the event, Coralie, you can see on the program here on May 21st, she gave an address. So it wouldn't be surprising that you're going to have Coralie Cook give an address at such an event. But on the back of the program, she's also listed as a patroness because she had a role beyond just speaking there. Lewis Gregory hints at it on his History of Race Amity in America. He says, Miss Coralie Franklin Cook, semicolon, Professor George W. Cook, and then he goes on to name 14 other names, aided this endeavor. So 2 of the 16 individuals he chooses to name are the Cooks. And when you look through the whole program, you see Miss Lulu Very Childers of Howard University and all these other individuals who are all connected to Coralie Cook. Miss Lulu has a building named after her at Howard. Of course, her husband, George Cook, basically ran all the administration at Howard. Dr. Elaine Locke, of course, who's a professor at Howard and a Baha'i. Mr. Roy Tibbs, whose wife fills the DC Baha'i archives with Baha'i events she spoke at, the famous opera singer. And then you got Coralie Cook, and you got Dr. Wormley. So you have all these Howard University administration individuals participating in this race amity event in 1921. And then similarly, from her artistic efforts, like I showed you the 1917 event where she had the Artistic Association, she's been leading artistic association since 1903 in DC. And so all this group of individuals all associated with Coralie artistically, and they all contributed to that 1921 race amity event. Like Mr. Joseph Douglas, who many people take note of that he performed at the Race Amity Conference of 1921. Well, he's a member of the Samuel Coleridge Taylor Society, along with Coralie Cook and George Cook. So they've made these great contributions, and now we're kind of seeing the next phase of both of their lives. So on the one hand, the National Spiritual Assembly is elected for the first time with that name in Washington, in America, and 2 women are included, thanks no doubt to Corinne's hard work of pushing the issue and helping to realize this. And so Florence Morton and Amelia Collins are elected to that first assembly. As you see, Corinne's now moving out of the elected phase of her life and now more into a supportive role. And similarly, Coralie is now starting her writing career in the Baha'i Faith. She's going to become the most prolific African descent writer in the Baha'i writings. And in 1924, she begins with A Basis for World Unity. It has a lot of quotes in it throughout her writings that you can quote. Here's one: the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man must prevail, and that I as an individual may not turn aside from nor escape my personal responsibility in establishing these truths. So she's giving us this really, you can feel the power of her oration as you read these words and picture how Coralie Cook would sound. And here on the left, I have a picture of the fan art. Coralie Cook is quite famous in America, and a lot of people do images of her and so on. Here's a person doing a drawing, an impression of what she might look like. Corinne played another important role of keeping the faith community together as Abdul Baha passed away and his grandson Shoghi Effendi took over leadership of the faith. But in 1927, Corinne continues on the correspondence with Shoghi Effendi, keeping the community together, keep guiding the way forward. And similarly, Coralie again contributes to the Baha'i magazine with her powerful writing. She gives another great quote in this article: "True, the world is afflicted," and this really applies to today when you think about how you might be feeling right now. "True, the world is afflicted with injustice and wrong, with hatred and evil doing, with slighted religion and unpracticed creed, but crystal clear comes the Baha'i teaching to deliver us from evil and bring the very kingdom of glory of God to encompass the world and establish amity and understanding among the children of men. So such a beautiful, powerful expression of the Baha'i faith by Coralie Cook. And then in 1927, Corinne returns from pilgrimage, and then they've been advised to have regular meetings in the foundation hall. Here's what the foundation hall looked like in 1927. So you can't see any of the temple yet, but you can go in the foundation. And she brought 3 rugs from the tomb of Abdul Baha, which Shoghi Effendi had given her to put up in the foundation hall. And similarly, Coralie Cook joins the National Baha'i Interracial Amity Committee. And so they're establishing a committee now to oversee this infrastructure. So just like there's a foundation hall begun here for the temple, Coralie Cook has helped build a foundation for race amity that's expressed through this race amity committee that puts out the first ever race amity publication in 1927. Similarly, she gave a conference that year. She's no longer a speaker at the conference. She's now presiding over it. And Louis Gregory had just completed an article in the history of race amity in America, but the editors felt that Coralie did such an important role, they added an addendum to Louis Gregory's article. And it says, the convention created great interest and one of the most outstanding and noteworthy events in the history of the Baha'i cause in the city. So both of these things have been established. And then as they kind of finally complete their task, Corinne is pictured here on the temple steps as the superstructure is completed in 1931. And then Coralie continues to publish. Here she does a book review of a European descent individual who wrote something positive about those of African descent that Coralie wanted to call out. So they're both now getting this notion of the temple and the notion of interracial amity established firmly in our faith community. And then as their final act, just to show how far they've come from 1861, you have Corinne here representing the leadership of the Baha'i community at the first election of Baha'i National Assemblies in Haiti and Jamaica. And so she actually touched down in Port-au-Prince, you know, a country established by freedom seekers, and then went to Jamaica because there was too much electoral violence that year. But the convention for the election of that Jamaican and Haitian assembly was overseen by Corinne True. And amongst that group, you know, to see who she was associating with, people she never would have associated in 1861, was a picture here of William Mitchell, who's the uncle of Glenford Mitchell, who many of you know is a member of the Universal House of Justice. He was elected to the first National Assembly of Jamaica, Haiti. And also this lady here, Miss Elizabeth Hope Cheney, a friend, her family was a friend of President Lincoln's. And here is Corinne True associating with a friend of Lincoln here in 1957. And similarly, Coralie, you wouldn't have imagined her being an advocate for indigenous rights when you look at her early career. But by 1932, not only did she write an article praising those of indigenous descent, but she included a picture of them in the Baha'i magazine. You see what I mean? She's now applying what she's learned to the benefit of those of the indigenous community. And here at the end of this table wearing the headdress, you see Chief Standing Bear. So Chief Standing Bear is there. And in an article, he mentions his adopted niece and nephew, Walking Eagle and Sunflower. Walking Eagle has the hat on, the Boer hat and Sunflower there. They're also pictured, mentioned in this article. And at this event was Nippo Strongheart, who later on became a Baha'i, who I pictured on the left of those 4 pictures. That's Nippo standing there. You know, so Coralie has also transformed through her life. And so I think in a way to kind of capture the way that they both transformed the community and they work together, even though they might never have met. A wonderful Baha'i poet from Richmond named Margaret Danner caught an image that she included in her work of poetry that shows Coralie and Corinne standing together. This wonderful picture of Margaret Danner's grandson, Sterling Washington, standing on the steps of the temple that Corinne helped build, I thought really expresses them working their life together. And she wrote a beautiful poem about that I want to conclude with. It's called Muffin at the Baha'i Temple. You know what, said Muffin, wriggling his half a decade satinwood tanned hand in the ivoring one of the newfound friend, Rexford Parmalee, a Baha'i executive. Our church is lacier and bigger than anybody's, right? And it's called a temple, and it's made in a circle with 9 doors all around, so everybody can come in. Little Lamb peacocked his grandmother, that being Margaret Danner, and she began a beam that fast turned into a despairing frown as this ram now continued. And look, Whitey, look at what groovy rails to slide down, and these zillion of tall steps going up, 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 and out of sight to pitch pennies on. And he looked out, his little foot clenched his new friends even more tightly, and smiled while his grandmother, humbled now and losing all poise, yanked ferociously at him and mumbled a hurried good night. But Mr. Rexford Parmalee, proving himself to really be a Baha'i, bent reassuringly to pat the little boy's empty-headed hat and said, we must begin with the truth. And so with that, we can see that these wonderful women have been enshrined in these beautiful resting places at Oakwood Seminary in Chicago and at Lincoln Memorial Cemetery in Suitland. But unfortunately, Coralie's mausoleum has not been looked after. And so it's in a great state of disrepair. Here's a piece of that broken glass that you can see in the front door, all shattered. Inside Coralie's headstone is cracked in half. It's come down from the mausoleum wall because of water damage. And so I'm currently raising $47,000 to repair it. And so the first $4,200 milestone will remove those trees that are doing a lot of damage to it from underneath as a step as we work towards the full restoration back to the beauty of the project. So with that, I will close and see if Robert has any questions for us.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating, Lex. Really, you did a great job of explaining everything with clarity and with enthusiasm, and just marvelously well organized presentation. So I'm really delighted. I'm looking forward to seeing questions from people, but I have at least 2 that have occurred to me. One is, you mentioned Hemming, and how is Sally Hemming related to the family?
Great. So if you go back to when Betty Brown, Coralie's second great grandmother, was given as a wedding gift to Thomas Jefferson, she preceded the rest of her family. So Elizabeth Hemmings was still at the Forest, where she had been given as an 11-year-old wedding gift. And then John Wales had, given as a child, they had children together, right, with John. And so Elizabeth Hemmings had Sally Hemmings at the Forest. And then Sally and Elizabeth came and joined their sister and daughter over at Monticello. Mm-hmm. And then, so Sally Hemmings is the sister of Betty Brown. And then when Lincoln went to France with his
Jefferson went to
Thomas
France.
Jefferson,
yeah.
with his 11-year-old daughters, he brought Sally Hemmings, who was 14, to France to watch these girls.
Right.
And then when she came back from France, she was pregnant with Thomas Jefferson's child. And you could imagine these 13-year-old daughters knowing exactly what's happening with their father. And then, the book comes back, Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, because of course, Thomas Jefferson said they're physically unattractive and they smell bad. So he's using language like that to try to explain to his daughters that their eyes are lying. And
clearly he didn't feel that way about Sally.
No, he surely didn't. But this is the brilliance of that book. What I think that helps us all understand is the cognitive dissonance is not something humans can live with. They need to make up excuses.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. And then of course, he ended up ultimately liberating some of those kids in his will as well. So that's fascinating. It's really a really fascinating story. And I'm fascinated that Coralie was able to get so much education. She is definitely of that first post-slave generation, or well, she was, of course, a slave, actually.
Yes.
How many African-American women of her generation got that kind of education? I would think it would be less than 100 or a fairly small number.
Yeah, and that's where you see how important understanding the various denominations in America is, that the Free Will Baptists truly believe in woman-male equality. And if you study their teachings, it goes deep to their understanding of the Bible. And so therefore, they not only went all the way to Winchester to teach Coralie as a 3-year-old. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't even think to teach a 3-year-old, but they're teaching her and recognize her brilliance as obviously Coralie's genius. And then go from Harper's Ferry to Winchester, which is a great distance, to say, hey, is that little girl still here? And then grab her parents, offer them work, recognizing their situation, having the empathy to say, hey, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. No, you got to come as a family. Her older sisters, Robert and Carolyn, had already had their own families and left Winchester. So she brought the younger sister, Mary Elizabeth, to get education. And of course, Mary Elizabeth then married the leading civil rights leader that nobody knows, Mr. Clinton, who led the Pioneer Press. So what an amazing benefit of that female-led leadership, which then Coralie could share with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs as she wrote their constitution, being quite familiar with the National Associations of Women of the Free Will Baptists. So a lot comes from that teaching that I think gives Coralie that leg up. And being a homeowner in 1884 when she's 23.
Yeah, that's really quite amazing. Quite amazing. And I'm also struck by what you said about Corinne True having joined in succession 3 different religions, which had been really founded by women and were still being led by women. And that's really quite a good point to make. These, of course, were very popular movements, religions, mostly with women. I don't think Moses True really had joined any of them. It was mostly her who was joining them. But it really is quite an interesting point that you've made there, actually.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that unites both of their expressions, because Corinne focused her work for equality within the Baha'i administration, and Coralie focused her on emancipation movement, on the suffrage movement. And then in 1913, that moment when she identified with the Bahá'í Faith, she had just been expelled from the famous 1913 suffrage walk in DC because of her African descent. So, and she was able to then look at the Baha'is and say Baha'is fully embrace women in voting and in positions of leadership. So, maybe Corinne had that part to play in making that clear to Coralie that was possible, that you have a movement in America where you can vote and run, not run for office, but be elected for office. So it's quite interesting to see how they both lived out that expression of woman equality.
I was never quite sure what you were just saying at the end, whether they had actually met. Do you have any evidence that they had actually met?
I mean, it's amazing. There was a 1922 Race Amity Conference in Chicago that Corinne didn't participate in, but did they meet? There was the 1915 Baha'i World Congress. Corinne was there. Coralie was on her way there, but they didn't invite Coralie to speak. So I don't think they met there. And then you have, these different functions, national assemblies and so on, where they could have met. So it has to be studied more, but it's not clear that even at something as big as the Emancipation Jubilee, where Coralie is, put by the governor as the vice president of honor, Corinne did not lead the participation because that feeling of that level of interracial amity was only present in DC at the time. And so 1921 clearly showed that the DC Baha'i community clearly invited Coralie to be a speaker and help lead. So it took a while for Chicago, I think, to catch up.
Yeah, there was it was after Abdu'l-Baha's visit that the Chicago Baha'is began to be concerned about attracting African Americans. And in fact, Corinne True writes a letter to, I believe, the Hannons, actually, about this, sort of saying, how did you do it? It seems to me I've seen that letter somewhere. It might be referred to in Baha'i Faith in America, Volume 2. I can't remember, but she's the one who decides it's important to start reaching. She's one of the people who decides it's important to start reaching African Americans. The other one, it would have been Zia Baghdadi, who, of course, spent a lot of time in the African American parts of the city of Chicago during the riots, or what I think 1917. He was moving food in to people he knew, so they would be able to get food. And of course, that was an enormously dangerous thing for him to do. Mm-hmm. So they were the ones who.
Robert, you know the story of Pauline, of how she decided to begin teaching the African Americans in 1902? Maybe you're the one who gave it to me.
It's mentioned in Volume 2. Yeah, it's mentioned in Volume 2. And of course, it comes from her papers, which are in the DC archives.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that somebody who's already Baha'i, and then she bends down to tie the shoelace of a woman of African descent who had her hands full. Yeah. That simple human natural act then startled everybody. And I think what came across in Coralie's reaction to the Hannons is the sincerity. And you remember when Joseph Hannon went on pilgrimage to Abdu'l-Baha, he felt it was his wife's domain to teach those of African descent. But then, Abdu'l-Baha said, you must, right? And I think, he put his hand on his head and everything in his bald spot.
Interesting.
But the fact that Joseph then also realized it was his spot, I think helped pave the way for everyone to realize, not just the enlightened Pauline, but everyone has this role until it became such that the DC community, held events in Harriet Gibbs Marshall's beautiful house.
Well, I suspect that it also helped that Pauline's mother and her two older sisters were born in Germany, because there they were not raised with prejudice. Now, Pauline, of course, grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, and she probably had more exposure as a young woman to racial prejudice than her older sisters and her mother. And so I've often wondered whether that wasn't a factor for why the family was able to be so supportive of reaching African Americans. I don't know.
I can share my own experience as not growing up in America, as an Estonian community, that I didn't grow up with the beliefs in white and black that most Americans have so deep in their mind, they don't even realize that's a racial ideology. That's not a fact. And I remember I was at a Nat Rutstein, who wrote this wonderful book on Corinne True.
Right.
He had also established the Baha'i Racial Healing Institute.
Yes.
And so 15 Jewish children were gunned down in LA when I became a Baha'i, and I was in Tucson. And so the Baha'is of Tucson decided to use Nat Rutstein's Racial Healing Institute. And so I'm sitting in the circle of Baha'is, and somebody called me white for the first time. Huh. I'm realizing how deep it is in the American psychology to actually believe we're different people.
Yeah.
Use these words like white and black, like as if they're real.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned that when I was in college, and I was suddenly exposed to people who were not white Protestants. I suddenly realized that I had been dreadfully excluded from the diversity of the world at that point. We have a few comments here. Shervin says, well, no, Shervin's had the problem that she was, they were hearing two different sound streams, and the one was out of sync with the other, but that doesn't seem to be a case right now, and I haven't noticed that at all. So it may have to do with the way the internet has been working for Shervin. Ezra mentions that this is maybe someone you know, I guess. Joseph Douglas was Frederick's beloved grandson. There's a photo of the two of them from 1894, with Joseph standing with his violin on his arm, posed opposite his seated grandfather, taken just a few months before his death. So I suspect you know who that is. And then there's a reference by Burton that Edward Braithwaite was one of the people who read a prayer at the Gregory's wedding in 1912 in New York City.
That's right.
And of course, Gwen Eder Lewis has praised your presentation very highly. Thank you for helping us better understand both amazing women. F. Lossemi asks about how to be in touch with you regarding the work on Coralie Cook's memorial. And I assume that can be arranged fairly simply by they can certainly write care of the Corinne True Center, and we can forward any emails to you. That would be very easy to do. So certainly we can take care of that. I'm trying to think what else. Those are the questions that I've seen so far, and I hope people can offer us some more. How long was she associated then with Howard? Was that something she continued to be associated with all her life? Howard University?
Yeah. Her home is in Howard campus. Because Cook, Cook basically is Howard. If we all lived in 1930s, we couldn't think of Howard without thinking of George Cook. And so, their house is in Howard. When her mother passed away, the funeral event before the internment was at Howard. They live in Howard. That's why they welcomed Abdu'l-Baha to their home, basically, when they welcomed him to Rankin Chapel. The centrality of the Cook family in the 1912 event, will more fully come to light through the biography. I think people will appreciate better the central role of the Cooks in that event, because a lot of people talk about that event. I mean, it affected me very much because a professor at Howard began commemorating that event in the 1980s to help bring it to light. So when I moved to DC as my first American Baha'i community in 1995, the first event almost I went to in April was the talk at Howard when Abdu'l-Baha, said to me, honor those of African descent, work for mutual advancement. And this creates love. I still think that's a message that America could benefit greatly by, because the notion of creating love might not be well known, but to Baha'is it is. And the fact that you can honor someone and you can work for mutual advancement and that creates love, to me, is demonstrated by Coralie's family responding to the restoration of mausoleum by sharing this image of Coralie that no Baha'i has ever seen before, of our beloved Coralie Cook as a young 20-year-old lady.
That's marvelous.
So I think this speaks to the fact of how continuing revolutionary Abdu'l-Baha's teachings remain today. And I'm so happy the DC community again commemorated that talk at Howard University.
What was his role at Howard, and was he president? And then, and what was his relationship with the faith?
Sure. So he's not president, but he took the role. He's been there as a student, as a grad student. He's been there as a professor. He's been there as a dean, and he's head administrator. Like, for instance, he made sure the U.S. government ran an officer school in World War I. He gave the Howard campus for that purpose. Wow. And of course, that produced so many leaders in the African descent community as we became officers and went to France, where we got treated better than in America. And then they came back here with that experience. So Cook was the one in charge of that. So he's like head administrator, but he kept always teaching, sometimes in the law school and elsewhere. But he kept both kind of roles. But he took such a leadership role throughout the community, helping lead the NAACP in DC, help leading, all these societies. So they were kind of like a central figure. And then he established the first ever fraternity at an African descent school. He took the one from Princeton, and he established it at the HBCU for the first time. And then, nobody ever connects how this all links, because they don't think about the Cooks as a couple. But 2 years after that, Coralie Cook helps establish the first African descent female sorority. But you can see the connection. They're sitting across the table, and they say, hey, what you did for them, why can't I do that for them?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, do it. And then they both got made honorary members. So I recently met with the Delta Sigma Theta leadership, and some of them knew she was an honorary member and some didn't. But they had to open up the history books, and I said to them, well, if you have the master organizer, you have some young college women, where did they learn the organization from to make a national organization? From somebody who's done it 100 times. Yeah. To me, it seems the most natural thing that they honor her as an honorary member. on their opening feast, the very first time they ever met. They honored. So I'd be like, thank you for helping found us, Coralie Cook, an honorary member. So that kind of stuff, I think, will come out from the biography, because saying she's a founding member of the National Association of Women's Clubs doesn't explain her role as writing the Constitution.
Right.
You know, so it's kind of like just throwing out words. Like, she's the head of Christian Temperance Union. Yeah, but she began a relationship with Frances Harper, who's, you know, the leading abolitionist amongst African descent women in the whole country's history. You know, and a great scholar. She wrote the first ever novel by an African descent woman of fiction is by her. And you see how Coralie Cook copied her and learned from her mentor and learned from. So this close relationship between Harper and Cook hasn't come out either. So I think there's a lot more to learn about Cook. And I think as you appreciate that what her family has been through up to her birth helps position you the monumental achievement of her life, like you said, of getting that education, of a first-class education.
Absolutely. There was by the way, a recent study, I think I read about it last week or this week, that actually was able to quantify the effect of African Americans going to France, and how it increased the percentage of the veterans, a higher percentage of them actually then getting involved in civil rights type activities after World War I, especially the ones who were in combat roles as opposed to ones who were peeling potatoes and kinds of things in France. It was quite interesting. Another question here that Gwen asks, do you have information about George and Coralie's son?
Yeah, that's an interesting, thank you for raising that. So their son, I'm still working very hard to learn more about his early life, what schools he went to and so on. But the one thing that really stands out is that he went to Europe, France, to borrow your line. And so when the Germans invaded France in World War II, they put all US people in prison. And so George Cook Jr. was put in prison in France for 4 years.
Wow.
So you could imagine how that hurt his health. So when he returned in 45, he died 3 years later. So I could imagine he was in very poor health and then passed away. And his burial is also in that mausoleum. So we will also be repairing George Cook Jr.'s gravestone, because the way the inside of the mausoleum, when you open the door behind this broken glass, you have George Cook, born in the 1932, then you have Coralie, and then you have George Cook Jr. Kind of their bodies are still there. It's just the headstone plates have all fallen off the wall from the water damage. And Albert Cassell, who built the mausoleum, built almost every building at Howard. And so he's considered the greatest African descent architect of the 1930s. And the Baltimore Afro-American commented on this mausoleum when it was first built in the 30s, and said it was the most beautiful mausoleum in DC. So I think once we restore it, it'll come back to its shining white granite, and then the brass gold-like stones. And we're going to highlight it with lights, floodlights at night, because one of the busiest highways in DC, Suitland Parkway, goes right by it. So all Americans will be enlightened to think about Cook's mausoleum. And then 3 graves over is Carter G. Woodson's headstone.
Yeah. People want to be in touch with you. Can we put your email address in the comments down below? What is it, lex.musta?
Yeah, lexmusta@aol.com.
With all one word, right?
Yeah.
I'll do that. AOL.com. So that should help with people wanting to be in touch with you. Several people have been asking me, actually, privately by email while all this is going on. And thank you for the repair fund information, because people were asking about that as well. And I suggest if people want to know about this, they better write it down quickly, because we probably are going to be going off the air in another minute or so. And then, of course, this will all disappear. I don't know if we have any other questions in particular. I was going to ask you more about the mausoleum, but you just gave all that information. So his son is buried there as well as both parents.
Yes. And I'm going to put the site on the website as well for the mausoleum in the chat.
Good.
Because it details what the $47,000 cost, because it's quite confusing to understand why is it so expensive to repair. But basically, we have to waterproof it so it doesn't just happen again. And that waterproof epoxy is very expensive.
At least not for another 100 years,
Yeah.
since nothing will last forever, of course. When was he born? When was the son born? What year? You said 32?
No, it was 1901.
1901. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he was actually
quite young guy.
When he passed away in 1948, he would have been 47. Yeah. And no descendants.
No, but as I showed you that picture, Ariel Franklin, Robert has descendants, her oldest brother.
Right.
Her second sister, Caroline, has no more descendants, but her second eldest daughter, Mary Elizabeth, has a lot of descendants too. And so Stephanie Neal from that line is involved in the project. And then George Edmonston, whose picture I showed, his descendants are involved in the mausoleum project as well. Bill and Eva Webb, they live in New York. So it's really wonderful to unite the family through this project.
Yes, that's marvelous. That's marvelous. Well, I think that's pretty much all the questions that we've had. So thank you again, Lex. This has been just really a fantastic presentation, really top notch, and we're really grateful for it. So that's it today from the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. I hope everybody can join us next Sunday on April 13th, when Karen Webb will be speaking about Qudus, offering a comprehensive English biography of him. There's, of course, on our website, CorinneTrueCenter.org, you can get the link to that and all other information about our upcoming webinars. So that's pretty much it. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye until then.